Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. As you heard, my name is Aidan Sullivan, and I'm the Vice President of Photo Assignment for Getty Images. And I've been in this industry now for 40 years as a journalist. I got my first job as a copy boy on my local newspaper. And a copy boy, for those that don't know, is someone who runs up and down stairs all day carrying pieces of paper for reporters and sub-editors. And being England, it also meant that I had to make and drink copious amounts of tea. And I just remember the moment I walked into that newsroom, even at the age of 16, I just knew that that was all I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And I've never looked back. I'm very proud of my profession. I'm always amazed at the extraordinary people it attracts, the dedicated people, passionate people, and people who often really believe that they can make a difference. But in so doing, they take enormous risk and self-sacrifice. I'm going to take you back 25 years to 1989, and I was the recently appointed Director of Photography for the Sunday Times in London. Enormous honor. I was 31 years old, and it was extraordinary. And 1989 was an extraordinary year for news. It saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, and really the beginning of the end of the communist regime. And one of the events that took place that year saw the fall of the dictator, the much hated, much loathed, and much feared dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu. Basically, civil unrest had broken out in Romania that very, very quickly erupted into a full revolution that eventually saw, within just a matter of days, the trial and execution of Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife. But I had to get together a team to go and cover the event, and I put two of my senior photographers on it. But there was a young photographer who was a friend of mine who was desperate to go. This was going to be his first ever major foreign assignment. And Ian Parry went with the other two guys, and he was actually filing some really great pictures. And we had our last issue of the newspaper just before the Christmas period. So once they'd all filed the pictures, I said to Ian, look, come home. There's no issue now. After Christmas, we're going dark for a couple of weeks. So come home, spend Christmas with your family, and from there, you can always go back again, and you can pick up events after the Christmas period. But Ian was determined he wanted to stay. He wanted to carry on shooting. He thought it was an important story. So he carried on. And then I got a phone call from him to say, just after Christmas, that he'd managed to find a seat on the first ever aircraft out of Bucharest after the revolution. And it was going to fly to Belgrade, and it was going to pick up urgent medical supplies. And this was quite a feat in itself to get on this plane. But a typical gesture from Ian was that the night before he flew, he bought a bottle of scotch. He went and got all the other photographers into his room and offered to take back all of their film. Remember, this is pre-digital. Little rolls of film. But it was a typical gesture from Ian, he was the most generous and kindly of men. Very early the next morning, I got a phone call at home. It was Reuters, to tell me that something bad may have happened. And by the time I reached my office, they confirmed that the plane that Ian was traveling on, the first flight out of Bucharest, had been shot down. It was hit by a missile, and everyone on board was killed. Ian was 24 years old. I sat in my office, and I cried my heart out. 2 days later, I had to fly to Bucharest to collect his body. It was the hardest thing that ever happened to me, and I still think about it every day. And to try and make something positive from such a tragedy, I started a scholarship in Ian's honor. And basically every year for the last 25 years, we award a bursary to young photographers who are following in Ian's dream. And I know he'd been incredibly proud every year to know that this is going on in his name. But I think the highlight of the year for me is during that award ceremony, all the photographers are under the age of 24, when one of them comes up to me and says, "What was Ian like?" And that kind of makes it all good again. 1,054 journalists have been killed since 1992. Let's put that into context. That's every single person in this room multiplied by 3, killed or murdered doing their jobs. Hardly any prosecutions. 121 were killed in 2012. 76 in 2013. There have been 22 this year so far. 90%, more than 90% impunity. These figures are appalling. But the really scary thing is they're escalating. Journalists were once seen as unbiased, neutral observers who were there to bring us the news. Now, they're targets. Now, obviously, I'm incredibly concerned about this. These are my friends and my colleagues. But why should you be worried? Why should it affect you? Well, think about it. Every time these brave men and women go to these dark corners of the earth and take all these risks to bring you the news, it has an effect on us all. If we don't know what's going on, if they're not there to do this for us, we won't know about the atrocities. We won't know about the torture and the imprisoning and the shelling of innocent people. We won't get that news because the journalists on the ground, who are domestic journalists who live there, and the journalists that are parachuted in to cover it, just won't be there anymore. And that will have an appalling effect on all of us. And the bad guys will win. And that's just not acceptable. So you should be concerned. This affects us all. A long time went by from Ian's death, and the next time I got a phone call, I knew it was inevitable, really, with the career that I decided to choose. It was going to happen again. But when it came, it didn't make it any easier. And on April the 20th, 2011, I got a phone call from Human Rights Watch to tell me that 2 of my very close friends and colleagues, Chris Hondros, pictured here, and Tim Hetherington, had been killed in a mortar attack in Libya. Our entire industry was devastated, really. These were 2 incredibly well-known, incredibly experienced, incredibly respected, and much-loved men. And it really hit us hard, yet again. At Tim's inquest in London, the coroner announced that it was an unlawful killing. Evidence had been brought forward which would suggest that they had been targeted because they were journalists. A year later, I was the chairman of the World Press Photo Competition in Amsterdam. And we awarded a prize to a young, almost unknown French photographer, Remy Oschlik, who had produced an extraordinary body of work from the Arab Spring. It really was remarkable. And I was really looking forward to meeting Remy and discussing the crisis in the Middle East and him and his work. But between awarding him the prize and the awards event only 2 weeks later, both Remy and one of my lifelong friends of 30 years, the legendary foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times, Marie Colvin, had been killed in Syria. The night before Remy and Marie died, Marie had sent an exclusive report to CNN. In it, she spoke about a rocket attack on a civilian area of Homs where they were, And she spoke about being at the bedside of this young girl and watching her die and hearing her last breath. It was a remarkable report. The thing is, the Syrians didn't like that. They didn't like that that news was getting out there. So what they were doing is they were triangulating the data transmissions from this tiny little makeshift media center that they were working from. And they sent in a rocket, and they killed them. They didn't stand a chance. This time, I was really, really, really angry. This was premeditated murder. They had decided that they didn't like the news that was getting out to the wide world. So the way they were going to stop this was not killing the people, it was to kill the journalists. I was incensed, and I thought there must be something we can do. I met and had dinner with the director of the International Committee for the Red Cross in Geneva, and we were talking about this escalation, and that I was going to be on a panel at the UN in New York to launch the World Press Photo Campaign. And I said I wanted to try and do something. I want to try and get support, get some lobby around this. And he said, well, why don't you go the whole way? Why don't you just make it a war crime? A war crime to harm journalists working in conflict zones. So I did. On the panel, I suggested this. And a lawyer who was on the panel said, well, the thing is, it already is, by default, a war crime to harm journalists working in conflict zones. Because, as non-combatants, they are covered by the Geneva Conventions, as are all civilians. But you know what? That just didn't quite cut it for me, or my friends, photojournalists and journalists in the room. So after the panel, we all got together and we thought, well, come on, there's got to be something we can do here. There's got to be something that we can do as a groundswell that can raise awareness and try and give our friends and our colleagues more stability and more cover. So we decided to launch a campaign, A Day Without News. And the question mark was really, really important. Because what we were saying is, imagine a day where the risks are just so great, it's just so dangerous, that we can't report from these areas of conflict. And if this were to happen, and the big news organizations could no longer afford to risk the lives of their journalists, and the journalists who live there on the ground were just too scared because of the threats to their family and themselves, there'd be no news. We wouldn't know what was going on. And this is absolutely unacceptable. Now again in life, you meet extraordinary people. I'm sure you all have. I'm sure you'll meet many of them today. But I was lucky enough to meet such a man, and his name is Sir Daniel Bethlehem, QC, and he's one of the world's leading international lawyers. I spent 20 minutes with Sir Daniel, and within those 20 minutes, he'd mapped out an entire strategy for the campaign. And by the time I got back to my office, he'd emailed all of the people that I needed to see and set up meetings. So Sir Daniel and I flew out. We flew, first of all, to New York, and we met the UK ambassador to the United Nations and his team. And then we went to DC, and we met the US Security Council team. And our pitch was simple. What we wanted to do was, during the United Nations Security Council debates, which take place all year long, each of the member states have a presidency of the council for 1 month. So our pitch was, during your month-long presidency, we would like you to bring up this issue of the safety of journalists and impunity so that there can be an open debate. Being diplomats, they're not going to tell you yes or no straight away. It's going to take time. They don't do that kind of thing. There are too many moving parts. So we had to sit and wait. But while we were sitting and waiting, we were working out what the campaign was going to be about. And so we set 3 goals. The first was to raise awareness, not just within our own industry, but to the general public as well, of the dangers that are faced by our friends and colleagues. Secondly was to develop a public diplomacy to lobby government, to lobby the UN, so that they would look to better legislation that could help our colleagues. And lastly, and without doubt the most difficult, was to try and gather evidence that would bring about prosecution and put an end to impunity. So those were our goals. Some friends of mine at Getty Images and some other friends got together. We built a website. We set up all the social media platforms. And then we set about asking every single person we knew in the industry, and having been in it for 40 years, I'm lucky to know quite a few. And we said, please help us. Please help us promote this. Please help get it out there. So we launched the campaign on the anniversary of Marie and Remy's death on February the 22nd. And we reached an audience of over 120 million people. And that was just 4 of us on a website. It was extraordinary. We called in so many favors. Even the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, recorded a video in our support. The UK Prime Minister tweeted, so too did the number 10. We had tweets from Anderson Cooper, Christiane Amanpour. Actually, Christiane did an interview with us on CNN, which was fantastic, as did the BBC, which was wonderful. So we reached 120 million people, and we were really, really blown away. And then we had some great news. We heard from the US Security Council team that they were actually going to bring this up as an open debate during their presidency of the Security Council. And they met in July 2013, and they had an audience of members that took part, 80 members. It lasted 13 hours. And for the first time ever, they actually allowed journalists to sit in on the panel and take part. December the 18th, 2013, the UN General Assembly announced it was going to adopt a new resolution that would look at the safety of journalists and impunity. So we were really, really happy. We'd come a long way in a year, and we were ecstatic. One of the things that slightly was disappointing was the backing and support we got from major news organizations. People within those organizations who were friends of ours were really, really helpful. But we had no big media organizations lend support. And it's almost a kind of perverse reluctance to start a campaign that's about your own people. But my point is, if we don't do it, how are we going to expect anybody else to? So I'm going to leave you with this. I know that somebody gave the order to shoot down my friend Ian. I know that somebody started a mortar attack that killed Tim and Chris, and we absolutely know that the Syrian army killed Remy and Marie. What I'd like you to do when you leave here, next time you're sitting in your living room and you're watching the news from Syria or Afghanistan or the Ukraine, think about my friends. Think about the risks they took. And I want you to go on, and I want you to sign up, and I want you to show your support at A Day Without News, Committee to Protect Journalists, and Reporters Without Borders, and together we'll make sure the bad guys don't win. Thank you.